Industrialized countries generate the vast majority of hazardous wastes. Historically, waste trades have mostly taken place between industrialized countries. However, in the 1970s, most industrialized countries began adopting environmental regulations that made waste disposal more complicated and expensive. Due to the rising cost of disposing of hazardous waste within the industrialized countries, these countries started to ship hazardous waste to developing countries for disposal. Since the 1960s, both generations of hazardous wastes and shipments of hazardous waste increased sharply. More alarming to the public than the sheer volume of waste generated were several incidents in which waste from an industrialized country was improperly disposed of in a less developed country. These incidents draw media attention and spark demands for regulations from environmental NGOs, developing nations, and the public. Why is transboundary movement of hazardous waste an environmental problem? To answer this question, we need to know what hazardous wastes are. Hazardous wastes are corrosive, flammable, unstable, or toxic. Toxic waste can cause serious health problems and can even be fatal when ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through skin. In addition to human health risks, impacts on the environment can also be devastating. Hazardous wastes can kill organisms in contaminated bodies of water, cause major reproductive complications in animals, or otherwise limit the ability of an ecosystem to survive. Certain hazardous substances also have the potential to explode or cause a fire, threatening both animals and human populations. They may contain mercury, cadmium, arsenic, lead, and other dangerous elements. When disposed of improperly, those elements contaminate the soil. When it rains, the contaminated liquids can seep through the ground and reach waterways, thus directly affecting human health by contaminating the food and water supplies. In the 1980s, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development developed guidelines for managing the trade in hazardous wastes among its members, which are industrialized countries. The guidelines include a prior informed consent mechanism. This mechanism requires a waste exporting country to have written permission from the importing country prior to shipment. In 1987, the United Nations Environmental Program adopted the first global standards on hazardous waste management, the Cairo Guidelines and Principles for the Environmentally Sound Management of Hazardous Wastes. These new guidelines included a voluntary prior informed consent scheme for all transnational transport of hazardous wastes. Many developing countries and environmental NGOs did not think these guidelines are strict enough. They pushed for legally binding controls of transportation of hazardous wastes. The result of these demands was the adoption in 1989 of the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal. The convention aims to minimize the generation of hazardous wastes and to regulate and reduce the transboundary movements of hazardous wastes.
Three of the major actors that shaped the Basel Convention were the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the environmental NGO Greenpeace. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is an intergovernmental organization that promotes free trade and shared economic progress among its members. Its members are wealthy, developed countries like the US, the UK, and Germany. Switzerland, a member of the OECD, was one target of NGO demands for action following shipments of hazardous waste from Switzerland to Africa. In 1986, under the framework of the UNEP, the Swiss government initiated the global negotiation framework that would yield the Basel Convention. In general, the OECD countries wanted to limit the scope of the convention. They wanted to create an efficient, cost-effective instrument narrowly focused on transboundary movements of hazardous waste. OECD members thought state responsibility for hazardous waste shipments should be limited to direct violations of regulations, not including accidents or illicit waste trafficking. The OECD also wanted to exclude recycling material transfers from the convention, labeling recycling exports as, quote, raw materials rather than waste. Greenpeace is a global environmental NGO that, according to their mission statement, uses peaceful protest and creative communication to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are essential to a green and peaceful future. Greenpeace was one of the NGOs that brought public attention to disastrous incidents involving shipment of hazardous waste from industrialized northern countries to developing countries in the global south. Greenpeace framed the environmental problem as a north-south conflict in which wealthy northern countries were using countries in the poorer, less developed global south as a dumping ground. During the Basel Convention negotiations, Greenpeace and other NGOs were allowed to make presentations during plenary sessions at the opening of each negotiation round. Greenpeace distributed information packets highlighting the amount of waste shipped annually, scandals resulting from shipments of waste to developing countries, and projections of increased illness due to hazardous waste exposure. Greenpeace's main influence was through formation of partnerships with less developed countries and the media. Greenpeace wrote most of the concept papers presented by the delegations of non-aligned movement countries, directly influencing the outcome of the conference. Greenpeace saw the OECD's focus as much too narrow and pushed the non-aligned movement to view hazardous waste shipment as a development issue, highlighting the harms they would continue to suffer if developed countries didn't stop treating them as a dumping ground. Greenpeace favored a ban on north-to-south trade of hazardous waste. When it became apparent that this would not be achieved by the Basel Convention, Greenpeace and other NGOs feared that the Basel Convention would not improve environmental protection, but would merely legitimize the business of hazardous waste trades. Many suspect that Greenpeace's goal became to stop the completion of the Basel Convention by pushing for radical proposals that would not be accepted by the OECD. The non-aligned movement is a coalition of over 100 countries, most of which are developing and less developed countries in the global south. Many of these countries have seen firsthand the harms to the environment and human health caused by improper disposal of hazardous waste from developed countries. At the beginning of negotiations, non-aligned movement countries seemed ready to accept the OECD's narrow focus. However, lobbying by Greenpeace and other groups encouraged non-aligned movement countries to push for more radical action. Non-aligned movement countries pushed for regulation of transboundary movements of all waste, not just hazardous waste. They also wanted regulation of disposal, rejecting the OECD's stance that recycling should not be regulated by this convention. Recycling was ultimately included in the convention. The non-aligned movement argued that prior informed consent should be required from all parties involved in waste transfers, even non-parties to the Basel Convention. They supported civil law consequences for exporting countries in cases of accidents and illicit trafficking, and wanted waste transfers to be allowed only if the same environmental standards for disposal could be met in the destination country as in the country of export. Encouraged by Greenpeace, the non-aligned movement pushed the Basel Convention far beyond the scope originally intended by the OECD, yet many countries of the non-aligned movement had come to favor a ban on north-to-south exports of waste, and would continue to push for a ban amendment after the completion of the Basel Convention. One major debate in the Basel Convention negotiations was whether there should be a prohibition of exports of waste from developed to developing countries. Such a ban was viewed by the OECD as a radical and unacceptable proposal from the non-aligned movement and their NGO allies. The OECD raised questions about the implementation of such a ban. Should responsibility to stop transfers fall on the exporting country, even if it had been organized by corrupt officials in the importing country? Ultimately, the liability of importing states involved in illegal trafficking was upheld, a victory for the OECD. Progress on a ban was not made at the time of the original Basel Convention. The Basel Ban Amendment was adopted by the Conference of Parties in 1995, but it has not yet received enough ratifications to enter into force. Another major debate was the inclusion of waste management standards. Non-aligned movement members wanted to allow waste transfers only to countries with environmental standards for waste management equivalent to those in the exporting country. The OECD argued that this was unacceptable because there was no way to ensure equal standards, even in trades between two developed nations, which make up the majority of hazardous waste trades. It seems to the OECD that the non-aligned movement and their NGO influencers were not just trying to ensure environmental safety, but were trying to eliminate waste trade in general. The final treaty requires that waste transfers be to sites where disposal is, quote, environmentally sound, but not necessarily equivalent to standards in the exporting country. Another debate centered around waste reduction. Greenpeace and the non-aligned movement saw waste production as the result of consumption habits in developed countries. The OECD agreed that waste reduction should be a general policy goal for all nations, but recognized that implementation at the national level would be difficult. The principle of waste reduction was adopted in the final convention, but with no specific requirements or targets. The non-aligned movement, countries, and Greenpeace supported mandatory prior informed consent from transit and waste importing states. The OECD and other industrialized countries argued against a mandatory PIC mechanism because they believed it would be an unnecessary administrative burden and would give transit states the right to veto shipments. Prior written consent from importing and transit countries was ultimately required, a victory for Greenpeace and the non-aligned movement. Nuclear wastes were another contentious issue. Greenpeace and other NGOs, non-aligned movement countries, and some developed countries argued for the inclusion of nuclear waste in the Basel Convention. While there already existed a code of practice for international transactions involving nuclear waste, there was no comprehensive and legally binding regulatory framework at the time. Ultimately, nuclear waste regulation was left to other bodies, not accomplished by the Basel Convention. In summary, pressure from NGOs like Greenpeace caused the developing countries of the non-aligned movement to demand action that went far beyond what the OECD had originally intended to create. Greenpeace wrote proposals for the non-aligned movement and publicized non-aligned movement positions, making it difficult for the OECD and other developed nations to stop the inclusion of recycling regulations, mandatory prior informed consent, and increased liability for waste exporting countries. In the end, Greenpeace, other NGOs, and many of the developing countries of the non-aligned movement were disappointed that the Basel Convention did not include regulation of nuclear waste or a ban on north-to-south waste transfers. Further action would be taken on these issues later. Despite the disappointment of some actors that preferred more radical action, the Basel Convention did achieve the first global regulation of hazardous waste transfers. This was a significant accomplishment considering that some powerful developed countries like the US would have preferred to maintain bilateral contractual agreements rather than create a global hazardous waste regime. After years of difficult negotiations, the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal was adopted on March 22, 1989. There are 187 parties to the convention, which entered into force in 1992.
The main goal of the convention is to ensure that transboundary movement of wastes is safe, secure, and consensual. Before a party can export wastes, they are required to ask for permission from states that they're exporting to and the states that their export will travel through. Then those states must allow the movement, or else the party will not be able to export the waste to their destination. If the states consent and the wastes arrive to their destination, the state importing them must have adequate facilities that can dispose of the waste in a safe manner. If there is an accident during the movement of wastes, the parties involved are required to immediately inform any states at risk and the Secretariat of this convention about the incident. They are required to provide information on the type and amount of waste that is involved so that the necessary procedures can be taken to protect human and environmental health. The convention sets what is considered illegal waste traffic as well. If the party doesn't ask for permission, doesn't wait for consent, falsifies consent, has no documentation for the waste, or the movement results in purposeful disposal of hazardous wastes that harms human or environmental health, it is considered illegal traffic. Each party is required to make legislation to prevent and punish illegal traffic. Once the parties have signed the treaty, they are required to designate authorities that will send and/or receive notifications of the proposed waste movements as well as respond to any notifications. Parties agreed to establish centers for training people on how to handle hazardous wastes as well as a place for technology transfers. There are currently 14 centers all around the globe. When a treaty is implemented, the parties are called to work together to improve and achieve environmentally sound management of hazardous wastes. This includes monitoring effects of waste management, developing new technologies that reduce the amount of waste produced, and spreading these technologies to other places that can use these new advances. It is also specified that all parties are to assist developing countries with minimizing waste and transboundary movement of wastes. The Conference of Parties was established to evaluate implementation as well as propose amendments to the Convention. During their 13th meeting, the Conference of Parties decided to forego the midterm evaluation in 2017. This is because only 35 parties out of 186 submitted information that would allow this evaluation. As of now, the Conference of Parties are working on a new approach that will allow for the final evaluation in 2021. As of April 2019, the Convention is still in effect. The Conference of Parties is still meeting regularly to discuss the improvements and alterations to the Convention. Currently, the ban amendment has not entered into force. The amendment requires 3/4 of the parties to ratify, and only 89 out of 186, roughly half, have ratified the amendment.